Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm so happy you're here with us today. I'm Julia Cutler, and I'm excited to be joined by author and health and science reporter for the Wall Street Journal, Amy Dockser Marcus. Welcome, Amy. We're so happy to have you here today.
Hi, it's nice to be here.
Great. I'll give some quick housekeeping information for our audience, and then we'll learn a little bit more about our guest. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation, so please click the comments question right below the video to submit your questions throughout the presentation. And as a reminder, the recording will be available tomorrow. Now, to properly introduce our guest, Amy Dockser Marcus, author of We the Scientists: How a Daring Team of Parents and Doctors Forged a New Path for Medicine, is a health and science reporter for the Wall Street Journal. She frequently writes about citizen science, rare diseases, and other topics. Amy won a Pulitzer Prize for a series of stories about cancer survivors and their social, economic, and health challenges living with the disease. Thank you again for joining us, Amy, and I'll let you take it away from here.
Great. Thank you, Julia. And thank you all for being here today. I'm really excited to talk to you all about how to become a citizen scientist and why it's necessary for finding cures for diseases. I wanted to start first just a little bit with my background. Julia gave a lovely introduction, which I really appreciate. And I do want to point out that, yes, I am a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. I cover health and science and have for more than 2 decades. And I'm also the author of this new book that I'm here to sort of talk to you about today called We the Scientists. And I wanted to just point out that everything I'm going to say in this presentation are my own opinions drawn from my own research and the book, and they don't reflect the viewpoint of the Wall Street Journal. Really speaking for myself and not for the newspaper. So I thank you for that. Just wanted to be clear about that. Why do we need cures? You can see the slide that I put up here, and this is a picture of me and my mom. And the reason why I put up this photo is because I think that at the heart of all of this, at the heart of my research, and at really the answer to the question, why do we need to be a citizen scientist, is because we all know someone or will know someone that needs our help, that's sick with a disease, that needs advocacy, or we ourselves will become patients someday, or we already are patients someday. And this photo of my mom was taken in 2006 at my sister's wedding. And you can see that we look so happy, and we are. We were. But my mother in this photo is very, very ill. She has metastatic gallbladder cancer. And 10 months after this photo was taken, she will pass away. And I put it here to sort of start our discussion, because the origin of me getting involved with this reporting started with my efforts to try to help my mom. My mother was an incredibly healthy person. She didn't have any sort of known health problems, but one day when she was 62 years old, she suddenly was doubled over in pain. The pain came from nowhere, but she couldn't move. And when my dad took her to the emergency room, the doctors told her that the pain was being caused by gallstones and that she'd have to have surgery and have her gallbladder removed. Many people have their gallbladders removed every year. Very simple and straightforward operation, they told her, nothing to worry about. And she did. She went forward with the operation. She felt fine after the operation was over. But about a week after the operation, her surgeon called her. The gallbladder had been sent to pathology for testing, and he told her that she had metastatic gallbladder cancer. This was a shocking diagnosis, and even more so after I started to dig in. I was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. I was a health reporter. I had spent a year writing about cancer survivors. It was a huge project. The premise of my project had been that there were more and more new drugs coming online that patients had access to, and that many, many cancer patients were finding out that they were going to live longer with the disease. They weren't going to die from cancer. They were going to have to learn how to live with it. So I approached this project with my mother to try to help her with a sense of optimism. I thought to myself, there's so much happening out there. There's so many new drugs, and I'm going to be able to do research just like I always did as a reporter and find something to help my mother. But when I dug into it, I found out that actually there was not very much out there to help my mother. The drug that the oncologist recommended to her, the drug that was considered the standard first line of defense, was an old chemotherapy drug that had been around for decades. And I recognized when I looked into the literature that the survival rate for gallbladder cancer, metastatic gallbladder cancer, was very, very poor. And most people who were diagnosed with metastatic gallbladder cancer died within 2 years, usually, of getting this diagnosis. Now, what made my mother's case different from many of the other cases that I had been highlighting in my own reporting was that gallbladder cancer was a very, very rare disease. Not many people in the United States are diagnosed with it. When I dug out the statistics, I saw that the NCI, the Cancer Institute, grouped gallbladder cancer with bile duct cancer. It was such a rare disease, it didn't even get its own category. And the numbers were quite startling. There were only around 5,000 to 7,000 people a year that were diagnosed. A very rare disease. And what did that mean when you have a rare disease? It meant that a lot of times there weren't very many researchers working on your disease because there wasn't a lot of funding available. The NIH did supply some funding to researchers, but very, very little. And the NIH is the major funder of biomedical research in the United States. When I looked around to see if there were any private funding mechanisms, there really weren't that many. So there were some patient advocacy groups that were getting started, but not a lot. And I really was in despair about what to do. Even though I had a background as a reporter, I didn't really know how to go about starting a patient advocacy organization, how you did it. And most of my advocacy on behalf of my mother was really trying to get her access to other types of drugs, to encourage her doctor to take her case seriously, and really just to hold her hand and take notes. And as I mentioned, even though the doctors did their best, she passed away after 2.5 years of getting the diagnosis. After she died, I started to think more and more about why it was so hard to advance drug development and help people and even to become a citizen scientist. And what I did is I said to myself, are there new ways of approaching collaboration to advance drug research? Is there a way for people to become more involved in science? How can we do it? And what I did is I ended up getting a grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and taking a year off from my job as a reporter. And the grant allowed me to travel around the country to meet people who were thinking about these similar issues and to ask questions about how can we do science better. Now, first, I had to answer a question for myself. Who gets to be a scientist in the first place? Now, the answer to that question is, I learned as I was delving into this, is that back in the 19th century, many people got to be considered a scientist. Science was something that amateurs did all the time. People built telescopes and they looked at the stars and they went into the woods and they gathered specimens. They had private salons where they met with their friends. They shared data together. Science was something that wasn't really considered a professional pursuit. It was something that everybody did. But the history started to change in the 1800s. There were more organizations, particularly in Britain, that started to think, well, something new is going on here. We can't all just go off and gather data. We need more rigor. We need more uniformity. We need something to express how to do science together. And in 1833, at a gathering of all of these amateurs and others who were pursuing science, one of the members of the organization said, we need a new name. We need to call people something. And they decided to call them scientists. That was where the word originated. As the years went on, in the decades that followed, scientists and science became something that was much more professional. It was more of a guild. Even though amateurs did it, professionals really took over. Some of this was because science became more complicated. It got more difficult to pursue science, and a lot of it started to be done at a university setting. There were people that needed to, study it and get degrees. There were PhDs, and the money that was being funded was increasingly done by the government. And the government needed to figure out how can we sanction the spending of money? We need people who are professional and have credentials. Over the years, science became much more professional, especially in our modern era. Now, there was a sort of separation now from the doctors and the scientists who are looking for cures and the patients that they were trying to help. Often the doctors and the scientists decided what drugs got tested and what diseases got studied. A lot of it was decided by their professional and personal interests. The questions they pursued were the ones that were interesting to them. Now, in the more modern era, though, patient advocates became much more aggressive and organized, and they started demanding more and more attention to their problems. They wanted to be at the table. They wanted to have a say at the table. And HIV activists were among the first who really drove this home. They self-organized, they raised money, they protested. Some of them, chained themselves, to the NIH and to the FDA. And they said, we really need to be involved. We really need to be part of this movement. The FDA actually did end up responding. And they created in 1992 something called the Accelerated Approval Program. And that came from a response to what activists and patients were demanding. They said, we're willing to take more risks, and we want you to approve drugs earlier, and we want to have access to drugs. And this really launched a kind of revolution, because patients who are breast cancer patients, they got involved. People with mental disabilities got involved. Other patient groups got involved. The FDA started putting patients on committees. NIH started putting patients on committees. It became much more common for patients to have a role. Now, even though patients increasingly had a role in some contributions in weighing in on, the data that was being presented to the FDA and sharing their personal opinions, something that didn't really change, though, was this question here on this slide, which is, who's considered an expert? And I want to look at you to look at the two pictures that I've shown here. One slide on the left is Chris Hempel, who's a mother of two children who have a rare and fatal genetic disease called Niemann-Pick type C. And on the right is a picture of Denny Porter, a devoted pediatrician and doctor who works at the National Institutes of Health. And he ran a clinical trial to test a compound that was potentially going to work in children with NPC disease. Now, most people consider Denny on the right, the doctor, as the expert because he has the credentials. He has an MD, he has a PhD, he works at the NIH. Chris on the left, she's a mom and she's not a scientist. But when her children became diagnosed with this disease, she turned herself into a citizen scientist. She really is an expert also. And one of the things that happened is that I got to meet Chris and Denny at an early stage when the two of them and others, many other parents and many other doctors and scientists, said, how can we recognize that both of these types of people are experts? Parents who are caring for their children every day, and doctors who are working on trying to advance the research, doing studies with mice and animals and cells. How can we recognize that both of these types of people are experts? Now, I want to sort of make an argument that of why the parents that I met truly were experts who really deserved a seat at the table. The parents organized themselves right away. They realized after their children got diagnosed that it was going to be very, very difficult to find a drug that would treat their children in time to save their lives. Niemann-Pick type C disease is a cholesterol metabolism disorder. Generally, what happens is the cholesterol gets stuck in the lysosome, which is a compartment in our cells. It gets stuck in this lysosome, so it doesn't process the cholesterol. The cholesterol instead starts to build up, and it has a lot of toxic side effects. Children have to be born with this disease. They inherit one faulty gene from each parent in order to have this disease. And many of them, when they're born, their parents and the doctors don't suspect that they have this disease because they appear typical at birth. But over time, this cholesterol starts to back up and they show symptoms of the disease. The symptoms can be anything from clumsiness, and then they start to lose the ability to talk and to walk. And over time, it gets much worse. And generally speaking, when children are diagnosed at an early age, like the Chris Hempel's children were, they live to an average age of 19. It's a fatal disease, and there aren't any cures. There is research that had been going on, and the parents knew that. There are patient advocacy groups that are funding a lot of basic research. They've made progress in understanding how cholesterol is trafficked inside a cell, but still they didn't understand enough to have a drug. There were no approved drugs by the FDA, and this was so frustrating for the parents. They knew, even with everything that was going on, all the basic research, that they had to be more involved. They had to be partners if they were going to try to advance understanding and get a drug approved. So one of the messages that the parents and the scientists sort of agreed on is, we're all scientists. And what they did is the parents organized themselves and came to the NIH. There was a scientist at the NIH who was running a lab named Chris Austin, and he also had an idea. Could we accelerate the development of drugs for rare diseases that were being overlooked by drug companies if we all worked together, if we sat at the table? Now, the parents, they really did see themselves as scientists over time. What did they do that I think also qualifies as kind of like science? The parents kept detailed records of all the drugs that their children were taking. They shared their children's medical records with each other. They went online and they created a sort of Dropbox where they could all look at the children's records. They really delved into the scientific literature. They read all the papers they could get their hands on about Niemann-Pick type C disease. They contacted the scientists who authored the papers. They would call them, they would ask them questions, they would introduce themselves to them. They really started to get mastery of the scientific literature. They recognized that there were commonalities across other diseases. They started reading about Alzheimer's diseases and other neurodegenerative diseases. They gathered all this information together and they met on weekly phone calls, Zoom calls. They would talk to each other. These calls were a form of support for each other. They would share what was happening in their children's lives. They would share some of the frustrations that they had, but they would also share the data. They would say, I read this paper and this seems promising, this idea. What do you think about it? And the parents would sort of talk to each other about it. They also raised funding separately and also together to try to support research projects that they wanted to see funded. Many of the scientists in the collaboration were applying for NIH grants, which are so important for scientists. That's how they advance their own careers. That's how they pay for their labs to run. But there were many questions that they were interested in also that the NIH wasn't ready to fund. The NIH said there's not enough data yet. We don't know if we want to fund this project yet. And so the parents played an important role here too. They raised money that they could then bring to the scientists and say, we all agree that this is an important question. We all want to spend money on this. We want to fund it together. And the scientists agreed. And in that way, they were able to advance a lot of the research that maybe would have taken years for the NIH to agree to fund. They met with the regulators and they met with members of Congress. The parents saw themselves as active participants. They called up the FDA and they said, we have questions and we want to talk to somebody who can help us. And the FDA did agree to talk to them. They would go to scientific conferences and introduce themselves to anyone who was giving a talk. And on many of the scientific conferences, NIH officials and others would talk there, and the parents would introduce themselves and get to know them. And after they formed this sort of collaboration together, they also would go to scientific conferences together, and they would meet individually with the scientists in the collaboration to talk about how to prioritize the drugs. What did they think was the most promising? And what did the scientists think what was the most promising? Sometimes they would disagree and they would try to reach a consensus. Over the years, eventually, the scientists and the parents would co-author papers together because some of the parents proposed hypotheses that they wanted to see studied, and the scientists would go ahead and study them, and they acknowledged the parents as co-creators of scientific knowledge. They also later on wrote papers together about their collaboration, the things that worked well, the things that were challenges for them, and how they came to formulate this collaboration. They wanted to make their work available to the wider public, and they wanted to get their collaboration published in the scientific literature because they recognized that many scientists and doctors don't take things seriously until they see it in the scientific literature. And that was another way they propose themselves and put themselves forward, not only as parents and patient advocates, but also as scientists and experts. They eventually decided on a compound that they found most promising. The compound was called cyclodextrin, and that became sort of the crux of my book, which is the next slide, We the Scientists. I spent more than a decade following this specific collaboration once they came up with this compound that they wanted to test. I was so intrigued by the way that they didn't always agree on how quickly to move from testing this compound in animals to testing the compound in people. And this was a source of tension because, again, the agenda of the scientists and the agenda of the patient advocates could sometimes differ. Many of the scientists said, look, we want to save the lives of the patients that are in front of us. We want to extend the lives of these children as far as we can. But when we gather data, we have to recognize that it has to be done in a rigorous manner so that we can advance knowledge that will also be useful, not just for patients now, but for patients in the future, for people actually who are alive now, but maybe haven't been diagnosed yet. And that was one of the sources of tension because the parents were more willing to take risks. They felt that the data that the scientists had gathered in animals and in cell models was ready for action. They wanted to put it into their kids. Now, how did they do that? How did they sort of push the scientists in a way? Well, some of the parents went to the FDA and said, we'd like to get compassionate use approval to give this drug to our children. This isn't a formal clinical trial. This isn't data necessarily that the FDA is going to use to approve a drug, but the FDA does allow patients who have lethal diseases for which there are no existing FDA-approved drugs to petition them with their doctor's permission and to say, we want to give this drug to our children or to a patient, and we want to see if it works. And the Hempels did that. They went to the FDA with their doctor. They presented the data to the FDA, the scientific studies that had been done, and they said, we think that this is a safe drug, and we think that we want to give it to our children. Our doctors are willing to work with us to give this to our children. We want you to approve it. And the FDA agreed. The FDA said, yes, you can give this drug outside a formal clinical trial to your children. Now, this did force the hand in some ways of the scientists, but the parents said, this is important. We want to gather this data. We recognize that it's not a formal clinical trial. The FDA is not going to say, parents, we're going to approve a drug based on, compassionate use, but we want to gather the data in a rigorous manner. When you have a rare disease, every piece of data is crucial. And they did work hard to try to organize the data and to gather together with the doctor's help to gather the data in standardized ways so that down the road, even once a formal clinical trial started, the data could be gathered. Now, eventually, the scientists reached the conclusion that some of these early proponents of putting it in the children did too. They said to the parents, we agree. We think that there's now enough data. It appears safe enough that we want to open up a clinical trial at the NIH and we want to enroll patients. And so they had these two sort of streams working together, a compassionate use section that children would enter if they didn't qualify for the clinical trial, and a clinical trial. And you had these two streams of data that were coming forward. This continued for years, and eventually the NIH gathered enough significant data and published it in a scientific journal, preliminary data, that seemed to indicate that this drug that the parents and the scientists working together, that it did do something. It appeared to benefit the children. It appeared to slow down the rate of progression of these terrible symptoms. It didn't necessarily extend their lives. There wasn't enough time to get that kind of data, but it was promising. And at that point, a drug company came in and said, we're going to license this data, and we're going to open up another trial now. We're going to have some people that get the drug and some people that don't get the drug, and we're going to get this data. And if the results hold out, we're going to go to the FDA and we're going to try to get this drug approved. It's important to get this drug approved because that's the way everybody gets access to it, because insurance companies will cover it. You won't have to pay out of pocket for it. It's going to be available to everybody. And that was the next stage. Now, the reason why this book took so long to write is because I kept thinking to myself, I want to have an ending where I know, is the FDA going to approve this drug? Is this clinical trial going to work? I kept going. I kept following this as it moved forward. And this company, eventually, the company that was in charge of the trial, did eventually show the results. And the results were very disappointing. There was no real difference between the people who weren't getting the drug and the people that weren't. Nobody seemed to be progressing at a very rapid rate. Now, the FDA was flummoxed by this, and they went back to the parents, and they went back to the drug company that had taken over the trial, and they said, look, we think that this drug is promising. We're not ready to approve it. But all that data that you were gathering with the families that weren't part of the clinical trial, we'd like to see that data too. We want to see all the data, and we're open to working with you to try to move this forward. Now, the way things happened is that the drug company that ended up with this drug decided to sort of get out of it. They didn't want to be part of this anymore, but another drug company came in and bought the rights to this drug. And the parents and the scientists and this other drug company, they're continuing to pursue an effort to research this drug and to get it approved. Now, but where did that leave the story? To me, where it left the story is, how do we do collaboration? Whether this drug ultimately gets approved or not is still an open question, but that's not really the only question. What do we take away from this? How can we all be scientists? How can we all become citizen scientists? And that became sort of the focus of my book, showing how these parents had become scientists themselves, showing how they won recognition from the other scientists and from the FDA and from even the drug company that became their partners to advance this drug, and how this model could work, for everyone. I wanted to share some of the resources that I came across as I was doing the research, because I want all of you to feel empowered by the story that I'm sharing with you, and to know that you too, if you want to become a citizen scientist, if you want to advocate for someone in your life or for yourself, you can follow some of the steps that these parents did and some of the steps that so many families and parents and advocates and patients are following every day now. And even if you don't end up getting a drug approved, or even if you don't even want to develop a drug, maybe if you just want to become an advocate for something that's already out there are things that you can do to make yourself a more effective advocate. So, for example, the NIH, in particular, the institute at the NIH that worked so closely with these families, with the NPC, this NCATS, they developed, in conjunction with many other patients and patient advocacy groups, a toolkit called the Patient-Focused Therapy Development Toolkit. It's publicly available. The link is here on this slide. And if you go to it, they walk you through how can you become a partner with scientists and with the NIH itself. How can you get resources for yourself and for the advocacy group that you hope to found? How do you advance the study of a rare disease or any kind of disease? they drew from all of the families, not just the ones in chronicled in We the Scientists, but all the families that have come afterwards and before that are working together, and they made a toolkit to help you. Now, also, another thing that I would recommend is that there are many families out there who have taken advantage of the internet and have written white papers that they share with anyone who wants to. They put it online. Many of the scientists publish their papers in peer-reviewed scientific journals that are behind paywalls and aren't always easy to get access to. But some of the families and some of the parents, they've published papers that are in front of a paywall that you can look up on the internet and get access to. I put the link to one of them that was written by Matt Might. He's a scientist himself, but also he's the father of a son who passed away from a rare disease. And he wrote a whole white paper that he calls the Algorithm for Precision Medicine. He wrote, and that's available online. He created this paper where he went through all the steps that he and his family went through, and all the other families that he collaborated with. He shows you how there are tools out there that could allow you to get your genes sequenced if you don't know what's causing a disease in your family, tools and resources, how to raise money, how to go about it. And, he wrote about he called it a living document. And he said that even though his son passed away, even though the drug that they identified wasn't able to save his son's life, he considers this effort to create tools for people to be better advocates and to become citizen scientists. That's like a lifelong effort that we all need to contribute to. And that link is up there also. I have a third link also that I've shown here, and this is called Patient-Led Research Scorecards. Now, this is another group. The Patient-Led Research Collaborative was founded by a group of people who had COVID, and they had long COVID. They weren't getting better, and they recognized that doctors were having to focus on people who were acutely ill, people who turned up in a hospital setting, with COVID. But what about people who had lingering symptoms? What were they supposed to do? Many of these people with long COVID, and by the way, they gave the name long COVID, they organized themselves online. They created patient advocacy groups, Slack channels, internet chat groups. They used Twitter. They found themselves and they talked among themselves, and they started gathering data. They started doing their own research. They raised money. They even were able to get some philanthropic donations to them, and they started giving out grants that reflected the desires of the patients themselves. Now, they sat down themselves afterwards and they said to themselves, how can we be better collaborators? And how can the scientists that we work with and the doctors that we work with and the advocacy groups that we work with, how can we be more effective at collaboration? And they were trying to advance this model of how to be better collaborators. And working together, they created these scorecards that are, again, publicly available. And these scorecards can be useful for you as an individual, or if you organize yourselves as a group, because they give you insights into what questions you should be asking before you go into the doctor's office and say, I want to be a partner. They talk about what you should expect and what contributions that you have the right to make and that you should demand. And they allow you to score either privately or collaboratively people that you want to partner with and people who might not be the most effective partners out there. I mean, these tools, I think, can be very effective. Some of the other things that I think that you should also keep in mind and that are available for you, as more and more of the families that I focused on in my book are coming forward and organizing, there is a recognition that they need tools. They can't just, replicate everything immediately. They're trying to take care of sick kids. They're overwhelmed. They don't know what to do. And more organizations are coming together to try to give advice to parents and families on how to form advocacy groups, how to form collaborations, and how to work together. So, for example, Global Genes, which is an advocacy group that the Hempels were co-founders of, Global Genes, helps parents and families organize themselves. You can go to, they're online, but they also have annual meetings where people come and meet and learn from other parents, other families who form their own drug development groups, patient advocacy groups, and others. The Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, that they actually have a whole network of rare disease advocacy groups. They give money to people to help them establish a patient advocacy group. You have to apply, you have to show that you've already done some research and that you're ready to form a group. But these resources are available. And this network gives access to parents and families and patient advocacy groups who want to work together and who want to go towards drug development. They give advice on how do you pitch a VC to get money once you have a drug development idea. And they also allow groups to learn from what others have done. They're also Ultragenyx, which is a rare disease drug company. Ultragenyx runs a boot camp in collaboration with and using funding from many other groups, but it's a boot camp where parents and patients and advocacy groups apply, and they go for a 3-day intense boot camp that gives them all the nuts and bolts that they would need to form a patient advocacy group, to try to bring a drug to the attention of drug companies, and to even advance the development of a drug if no one else is out there. And again, all of these tools and resources are available online. One of the things that I was really moved by during the course of the reporting was this recognition that all of these parents and these families, they are helping shift and create this whole new paradigm. When my mother was diagnosed, when I first started looking around, to me, there wasn't a lot out there. I didn't know where to go. I didn't even know how to turn myself into a citizen scientist. Now, I'm sure that there were things happening. Of course there were, because there were already activists. But what I noticed during the decade that I've been immersed in all of this is how amazing it is that there are so many parent groups out there. And the internet has allowed them to connect. And there are so many resources now. More and more people, including scientists, are making their papers publicly available. More and more people feel empowered to reach out to scientists and to say, hey, I want to talk to you. I read your paper. I want to work with you. The NIH recognizes that this is something that needs to be supported with money and with resources. And there are so many things online that you can find. And there are boot camps where you can get changed, where you can get training. There's also something called the Citizen Science Association, and their scholars meet annually and also publish a whole journal. And they've proposed also some policy shifts. They want to see the FDA establish a special pathway where they can evaluate citizen science research. And the FDA, has been much more open in speaking with activists and advocates who reach out. And so I hope all of you will feel like you can do that you can access these tools, that you can see yourself as a scientist, and you can join in what I hope is going to be a revolution. I think that we all can do this. We can all do this together. I want, before I open this up for questions, and I hope that you do have questions, and I want to have this be a conversation. I have this slide here where you can get in touch with me, because I've covered a lot of ground today. And if you have questions or you have your own stories that you want to share, my email address at the Wall Street Journal's here. I have a Twitter. You can tweet at me or you can DM me. This link here is to my author page at the Wall Street Journal, shows some of my stories, because over the years I've written about a lot of people who are doing these unique collaborations. And I consider my articles something that you can also learn from. And so I want you to feel that you can get in touch with me if you want to. And here also is a link to my book, because again, I hope that you'll read my book and buy the book, but you know what? You don't have to. Libraries have it. And I consider all of this information in my book, again, resources for you. I don't want you to feel what I felt when my mother got diagnosed, which is alone and confused. And you know what? I don't want you to feel that you have to reinvent the wheel either. So many people have done this now. So many people are doing it. And there are more resources here, more availability than there has ever been before. When I started this book, I really felt strongly about this title, We the Scientists. We the Scientists, like I chose that title with meaning, that we should all realize that we are scientists, that we aren't just consumers of science, although we have the right to benefit from all this science. We also are producers of science, and we should be helped and supported if we want to produce knowledge, if we want to be part of it. These collaborations are so crucial. I believe that if we all see ourselves as scientists, if we see ourselves as partners and collaborators, I believe not only can we find cures faster for ourselves, but we can also find cures faster for everyone, for anyone we love, and that all of us will benefit from this. We, the scientists, we can make a difference. And I hope you will feel that you can too. So I thank you for all the time that you've given me today and for being interested in this topic. And I hope that you'll feel that you can join in with the questions and with anything else. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to hope that you have some questions. Thank you.
Hi, Amy. Thank you for that. I feel like I'm echoing a little bit. Maybe not.
I don't know. I hear you.
Okay, good. Let's start with the question. Many of the parents in the book had resources that drove their investigation. What about if you don't have access to those? I mean, the resources are out there, but what if they just don't know where to start or even know that they exist?
That I think is such a crucial and important question. And it does come up a lot whenever I talk about this book. And at first, I want to say that yes, many of the parents did have financial resources, which they put to use, and they knew people they had social networks, which enabled them to raise money that they also used. But there were also many parents that didn't have those types of resources. And you're right. I mean, how do you know what to ask? And, what I can say is this. I think that there are now enough resources out there that many people, when they find out a diagnosis, they do Google it. And I think that that's important. Maybe there are doctors who still tell people, don't Google, although I think that's less common now. But I do think you should Google. And one reason I think you should is because you are going to probably stumble upon patient advocacy organizations that are already out there. Many diseases, even rare ones, now have patient advocacy organizations. If you're on Facebook, also you should search for the name of the disease that you or a loved one have, because most likely there's going to be a group out there. And if not, you can use the internet and chat groups to find to sort of put it out there, to try to find other ones. You shouldn't be shy about asking your doctor if the doctor knows about any patient advocacy groups, because more and more doctors do know that. And if you join a patient support group, which many hospitals and doctors can steer you towards, they can also talk about these resources. But I do think that it's important to realize that there are many more resources out there, and that if you have access to the internet, and if you don't, because there are still people that don't also, in a public library, you can get access to the internet and computers in a public library. So I'm really hoping that more people will feel empowered and won't feel like that they have to have their own money at the table in order to get access. But equity is such an important issue, and we should all of us, including NIH, FDA, and the government, patient groups, scientists, everyone, we need to be thinking about how we can make all these resources available to anyone who needs them.
Great. I agree. Anna has a question. She says, as a patient, how would I get my family and friends involved as citizen scientists?
That's a great question too. I mean, I think that as a patient, you are the best advocate, because I'm the experience that I had from reporting this book, and I've met so many groups along the way. I mean, often patients, when they share their stories with their family members and their friends, they want to help. I mean, I think it's a natural instinct for people to want to help someone they know. Many of the parents in my book, I mean, they got such help from their churches, from their religious groups, from their communities. I mean, from wherever they were working. Some of the parents, they were teachers. The schools took this on. I mean, and you know what? And some of the parents, they talked with their children's friends about this, and they started raising money through bake sales and wanted to help. And again, I think if you as a patient feel comfortable sharing your story with people that love you, your friends and your family, other trusted people, even at work, if you have friends and colleagues, I think you'll be sort of amazed at how many people do want to get involved. And then once they want to get involved, you can connect them with these groups. I mean, so many of these groups are comprised not just of the advocates and not just of their families, but of their friends. I mean, one of the people that helped found Global Genes with the Hempels, she wasn't someone who had a child with a disease. She was the friend of someone. I mean, and so I think it can make a difference if you feel comfortable sharing with people what's going on. And, that's up to each person to decide on their own what level of comfort they have in sharing their medical diagnosis.
Yes, I agree. So we have Canadian viewers as well. And so Carrie would like to know, do the ideas you speak to in your book translate to the Canadian market?
Oh, wow. Okay, that's a great question. Now, I don't have a lot of knowledge about the rules and regulations in Canada. I know that there are some differences in the laws, and so I don't feel like I'm an expert. But I do know that many people who were active in this collaboration that's at the heart of my book were from Canada. And I do think that any place that someone lives, I think you can at least apply some of the strategies and see what's available in your own country. You can ask your doctor. In many countries, there are patient advocacy groups. I mean, I think that would be the first step that I would do outside of the United States. And, many parents in other countries I know have set up advocacy groups. So while I can't advise you on the regulations of another country, I do think that the principles of organizing with like-minded people, using the internet to identify them or meet with them, sharing and asking, doctors to steer you in the right direction and kind of advise you on what the regulations are in your country. I think those are still good first steps that would apply to any country, not just the United States.
Okay, great. A question from Rehan. How and should patient groups be regulated?
Oh, wow. What a great question. I mean, that's interesting. I don't know how I feel about that. I'd have to give that some thought. I mean, do you mean that, the government should step in and require them to, meet some standards? I don't know how I feel about that because I think that certainly if you create a nonprofit organization that's going to get recognized, there are regulations that you have to follow and principles you have to follow. And that makes sense to me. I also think that if the FDA and the NIH develop novel ways to allow groups of patients and advocates to collaborate on filing and requesting public money, then I'm sure that whatever rules are going to be followed should apply to whoever is getting public money. So, there are privacy issues at stake, how the data is maintained, all of that. So I think definitely in that case, that would have to be sort of set out by the NIH and the FDA if they're going to open up the ability for these groups to participate and to receive public money.
Okay, great. Peter writes that he's writing a book about rare diseases that emphasizes the fact that rare diseases are actually fundamental. For example, that they provide scientists with a portal for studying diseases in a purer form. Categorizing rare diseases as fundamental emphasizes the benefits that rare disease research produces for people with more common diseases. What's your view of this shift in category on what is your view of this shift in category on paradigm?
I think that that is a great point that you're making, and I'd love to read your book when it comes out. And I think that your view is becoming much more widely accepted by scientists as well as regulators and also by patient advocates. I think that there's a greater understanding as we do genetic testing that even diseases that we consider common diseases now, when you start to do gene testing, you can really see that there are genetic drivers, and you can start to categorize some of these common diseases into just groups of rare diseases. And that in turn has led scientists to understand, you know what? There may be some molecular mechanisms that are driving some subtypes of breast cancer that are also similar and share commonality with some other disease that's not breast cancer. So you can definitely imagine a day where a doctor is going to have some sort of, gene therapy or genetic driven, therapy. And the doctor says, you know what? You qualify, and you qualify even though you have different diseases because your disease is driven by the same gene. And so I guess I agree with you that that we're seeing a shift in how we look at rare diseases, both as a way of getting insights into more common diseases that are on a similar pathway, but also a recognition that common diseases themselves may be comprised and divided into just a group of small rare diseases someday. So we are definitely heading in that direction.
Great, thank you. Margarita had a question. What about groups that advocate for anti-scientific misconceptions, like those against vaccination? How can we weed them out of citizen science initiatives?
Well, that is such a great question and a really important one. Look, there's always going to be people out there, and not just advocates. I mean, misinformation comes from all kinds of sources. There can be people that have what many would view as expert credentials that maybe promote science that's not as rigorous, but there can also be situations where people disagree on the best way to analyze evidence. And it's hard to separate that out, right? Because within science, scientists themselves often disagree when they're looking at evidence. And, that's something to think about. But I think that there's no real formal way probably to weed out this because it's hard to separate one thing from another. All that I think the best way to do this is to increase the amount of vetted information that's available to people, for people to speak up and to document why they believe what they believe. I think one of the things I learned from reporting this book is that it's not enough even for a trusted expert with fabulous credentials who's educated and has been in this field for years and years. It's not enough for them to simply stand up and say, I'm the expert, and that's why you should believe me. I think that experts need to persuade people. And I think that even when someone's an expert, they should marshal their argument. They should say, here are the scientific papers that you can read yourself as well. Here is my analysis of the data. Here's the data. You're welcome to look at it. It's publicly available. Here's the papers. They're also publicly available. You should download them. You should read them. And you should come to scientific conferences and you should raise your questions and we can talk about it. I mean, I think that's really the direction that we should go in. If we all think of ourselves as potential scientists and people that can help contribute to scientific knowledge, then I think that we should increase the places where we come together to talk and to share data, and that we should recognize that whether we're a patient or a family member or an advocate or a scientist or a doctor or a policymaker, that we can't just say, I'm right because I'm right. We should share what's the data, what we're basing our ideas on, and then open it up so that we can talk together and try to reach consensus. It doesn't mean we're ever going to stop hearing a voice that one or another person considers misinformation. But I think as more people come to trust each other and trust the data that's out there, that's a way to address the problem that you're highlighting in your question.
Well said. Maria says, where can we look online for existing medical journals, or where physically can we find the publications? Because do you need a specific medical connection to get access, or do you have to pay for them?
Okay, this is such an important question and really a huge topic that scientists and the sort of the field of science is wrestling with. So, there are growing numbers of what are called open access journals. Those are peer reviewed, scientists send in their papers and they're vetted and it's considered very, good information, but they're open access, meaning that you can find them online. You can start by doing a search for certain topics, and then you can get access to those journals. But there also still are a lot of academic journals that charge a lot of money, maybe $30 or $50 for each paper that you want to read. And that can get very prohibitive very quickly for people. And that's really a shame. Now, the NIH has been requesting more and more that people if they receive money from the government, that they make their paper available. So I think that you can at least start by doing your own search using search terms, that relate to your disease. And you can probably start by getting some papers that will be available. I like to read the footnotes because many scientific papers, they cite other papers. And so you can get a lot of other ideas, for papers in the footnotes, and, you can go one from the other. If you're feeling bold, you can also, any paper you do find, there is usually an email address provided on the paper of the corresponding author, who's generally the scientist. And if you write a nice, polite email to them and explain what, if you have a question, I found that many of the scientists responded to well thought out emails from parents and other advocates who showed that they had read their papers and they had questions. You can go into your public library and tell the reference librarian that you need some help doing searches. And I think reference librarians are so great. And many libraries can get access to medical libraries and that often have libraries. If you're an alumni of a university, and you may have privileges to your university's libraries as an alumni, that's another way of also getting access to some of these journals that may be charging money for the papers. But I mean, I think that's how I would start, to get started. But, again, I think it's so important to have more and more resources available to people, and easy to find by doing searches or by enlisting the help of a reference librarian.
Okay, great. We did have a comment from a viewer that said you can get around the fees charged by medical journals by accessing them through the online portal for the Library of Congress.
Oh, fantastic. Well, that's a great tip. Thank you for sharing that.
Okay, Chris has a question. Have citizen scientists emerged in psychiatric and mental health research?
There are citizen scientists. There are groups that are advocating for people to have more rights when they with mental disabilities and other disabilities. So yes, there are, and they've been more involved with also saying that if we need to consent to procedures that are done, we want to be involved with advocating. So yes, there are growing numbers of groups, I would say, in all these fields. And again, I don't have access to all the names of these groups, but if you start looking and searching around, you can start with the advocacy groups and support groups also, and they usually have a better sense of people who are partnering and doing this work in each field.
Great. And I think we have time for one more question, and we have one from Steve. Are there any apps that you would recommend which will enable users to determine which programs to become involved in and provide input or data into?
Oh, wow. That's really great. Okay. So I don't know apps off the top of my mind. I want to think about that some more, but I did put the link in to the patient-led research scorecards. Hang on, let's see. I don't know if I can get access to my slides at this point, but they'll be available. The link to the patient-led research scorecards. I found those scorecards. Well, it's not an app. I found those scorecards really useful, and they are a work in progress, and they're being done with a partnership between doctors also and patient advocates. And if you go to their link, I think that that would be a great start, because I think it would give you access to some of the other, maybe even potentially apps, but also other groups that are thinking about this, that are like collecting data. So I think I would start there.
Okay. I think Fred was looking for your scorecard slide.
Yeah, the resource slide. Yeah.
The
There's a
resource
link.
slide.
Yeah, the link. Okay, yeah, you see there's a link, patient-led research scorecards. I would poke around there, because I think that that might be fruitful for leading to some other things for you. Plus, some of these other groups, these links here, I think if you go to some of these links, there will be leads for you to find other apps and other resources.
Okay, great. And then Fred, if you could pop up the contact info, there you go. Someone was asking just how to get in touch with you, Amy. So
Oh, sure. I'm always happy to hear from people. And I will do to the best of my ability. I will try to steer you in the right direction when I don't have the answer, because I don't have all the answers. I'm out there learning just like all of you.
wonderful. Well, thank you so much for this hour. It has been so informative, and I'm sure people got a lot of information that is very helpful. And I want to just thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who